When I've done videos covering D&D, I've sometimes gotten comments like this saying, "Stay in your lane," to which I say no. Just because my focus on my channel so far has been Pathfinder 2nd Edition doesn't mean that I'm not going to talk about D&D and its history and future direction, because I'm interested. And in this video, I'll talk about the top 10 things, actually 20 things, that shocked me as a player of modern tabletop role-playing games, looking at the original Dungeons & Dragons. And people who follow my channel know that I can't keep myself short. I couldn't limit myself to 10, so 20 it is. I've always been fascinated by the creation, the evolution, the birth of Dungeons & Dragons, which not only birthed a type of gaming, but also arguably the entire idea of fighting fantastical monsters and a lot of the mechanics like leveling up that come from Dungeons & Dragons that now are the norm in a whole variety of game modes. And as we can see from the cover of the original D&D, the name role-playing game didn't exist. It was called Rules for Fantastic Medieval War Games Campaigns Playable with Paper and Pencil and Miniature Figures. That's a mouthful. As I now recover from my coverage of the Pathfinder 2e remaster, I decided to look at original D&D, partly for leisure, but also because I thought viewers of not only my channel, but people who enjoy D&D generally, might enjoy my musings and thoughts on the birth of the hobby. And also what I see in older editions of D&D that are the precursors of what we now see in current D&D and Pathfinder. I'm indebted to, and I refer people who are interested in this overall topic, to check out John Peterson's opus, Playing at the World, where he talks about antecedents to Dungeons & Dragons in the world of gaming, and also fantasy and science fiction literature. And also, I am inspired by the channel DM It All, which has excellent videos covering the history of the first few decades of Dungeons & Dragons. I think I can offer a unique perspective being a lawyer in real life, as opposed to fantasy life. A lot of people who would look at the text of original D&D might bring modern day assumptions to it and assume things that are not there. And my training allows me to look at the words for what they say, and also look at it not in the abstract, but as a historian. I have a curiosity as to what those words meant being uttered by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in 1974, and what it meant to the readers. And what exactly was so new about this game to people then, and what connected it to what existed in the past. First, to introduce myself, I am Ronald, the rules lawyer. I am a lawyer who has come to tabletop RPGs late in my life, relatively. I was born in 1977, and I grew up enthusing over the Menser Beck-Me series, the Red Box, Basic D&D, and the original core AD&D rulebooks. But I never got to play in person. It was only in 2010 that I started to actually play Pathfinder 1st Edition. I go over this in my bio wrap on my channel. 2 years later, I started running an after-school, middle-school role-playing game class. My actual play experience has been with what you would call modern role-playing games, such as Pathfinder 1st and 2nd Edition, Starfinder, and D&D 5th Edition. And still, I have a huge curiosity I've only played a little of, and want to play more of what we would call old school games, older editions of D&D, rules light games, and indie RPGs. If you enjoy what you see, join my Discord, which is currently Pathfinder 2nd Edition focused, but I love talking about other games. I hang out there a lot. And also support my Patreon. I don't earn money as a lawyer, and the Patreon allows me to continue making videos. You also get exclusive access to videos and early access to many of my videos. Okay, so the first thing that shocks a modern reader is that Dungeons & Dragons was a war game. It was the birth of something else, but it still had connective tissue to wargaming. Of course, it called itself a war game on its title. Also, the people who ran the first dungeon campaigns, first Dave Arneson and then Gary Gygax, ran them as part of consistent worlds. It was in addition to fantasy-based wargame campaigns with strongholds, warring fiefdoms, and the like. In the midst of establishing medieval castles and having mass battles, they would also dungeon delve in Blackmoor or Castle Greyhawk. The rules for D&D are not even in D&D itself. D&D was meant to be an expansion on the chainmail wargame, and D&D came in a box that was designed to be large enough to hold the chainmail book as well. D&D said nothing about initiative, morale, the structure of a turn even. The rules here are for mass combat, where a figure represents 20 people. And so in D&D itself, we see in the encounter tables that men or humans, appear in numbers of 30 to 300. Goblins and kobolds in even larger numbers. Also, a campaign consists of one referee and from 4 to 50 players that can be handled in any single campaign. Campaign meant not a single consistent group, but rather a consistent world that different play groups could assemble to play part of the story within on a map. The recommended referee to player ratio is 1 to 20. And it says that as the campaign goes into full swing, it is probable that there will be various groups going every which way and all at different time periods, and therefore it was important to keep strict time and to track when different groups went on their adventures in relation to each other. Original D&D was a mishmash of a wargame played out on a map with mass battles and smaller parties delving deep into dungeons and facing the perils within to grab treasure and get more powerful. Number 2, monstrous characters were core. This came as a surprise to me when I read it, but it says right after describing character classes and the races you could play, it said, there is no reason that players cannot be allowed to play as virtually anything, provided they begin relatively weak and work up to the top, i.e. a player wishing to be a dragon would have to begin as, let us say, a young one and progress upwards in the usual manner. Steps being predetermined by the campaign referee. And on the opposite facing page, it gives us this big chart, depending on what kind of creature you are, where you would fall on the alignment axis. And as you can see, men, elves, dwarves, and halflings are only a few of a huge number of possibilities players could be. This is further confirmed in the reincarnation spell. It says to use this very same table, and the reincarnated character must play as that creature. The original authors of D&D said, be what you want, no limitations. I imagine this didn't catch on because there wasn't a lot of rule support to make this fun, to have you start weaker and then have cool powers to look forward to. That was already provided by the core class system. Next is magic weapons were accidentally nerfed, it seems. Remember, the core combat rules for D&D were not contained in D&D. You were supposed to refer to chainmail. And chainmail had a combat system that had different variants to it. And the rules for one-on-one combat had you roll 2d6 to determine success. If you attacked with a dagger and attacked someone with no armor, you rolled 2d6 and you had to get a 6 or higher. Against plate armor, it had to be a 12, so very unlikely. There was additionally a chart for attacking fantastical creatures. Use the same system, 2d6. Regular men could not participate in this combat. You had to be a hero, superhero, or wizard. But as you can guess, a +1 from a magical weapon is very powerful when you're rolling 2d6, as opposed to rolling just a flat d20. The probability of 2d6 is on a bell curve, and getting a +1 on that bell curve is a huge boon. Anything above a +1 is a truly legendary weapon. That's the likes of Excalibur and other super swords. And accordingly, in D&D's magic tables, +2 swords are exceedingly rare. +3 even more so. There's only a 7% chance that any particular magic sword is higher than +1. However, D&D also introduced the alternative combat system, the system that actually caught on with referees and players. This is what we are familiar with. You roll a 20-sided die, and it becoming more difficult, the better the armor class of the target. However, a +1 magic sword in this context is much less powerful and impactful and exciting. So when people say, oh, a +1 weapon, meh, not that exciting nowadays, it's partly because its effect has been much reduced from the very powerful effect in the days of D&D's origins, when tables played with either one of these systems. And as an aside, as a kid in the 80s, I grew up with a dungeon board game, which actually was a precursor to D&D. I just thought it was really cool to see that its combat system, which involved rolling a 2d6 and hitting a target number, and that being dependent on your class, had its origins in chainmail. Also in that game, similarly, +2 magic swords were exceedingly rare. So it's effectively the pre-0 edition of D&D, the -1 edition. The dungeon board game, dungeon with an exclamation point, still exists today for people who want to enjoy this piece of history. The number 4 thing that is shocking to the modern player is that you were literally an average person at first level in D&D. When you determine your 6 ability scores, you roll them in order and you roll 3d6. So as you can tell from this example, you were just as likely to be below average in things as you were to be above average. A level 1 fighting man, which was the name of the fighter class then, had the fighting capability of man +1, while magic users and clerics were 1 man at first level. This makes sense within the chainmail combat system when you did mass combat. If you had 20 men go against 10 orcs, you would chuck 20 d6s for the men and 10 d6s for the orcs. And you would score kills based on the number of 6s you rolled normally. Now, what this man +1 means mechanically in the chainmail system, I actually kind of don't know. Like, if it meant an extra die, why didn't you just say 2 men? Meh. Just one of many things that were not really clear in chainmail and original D&D. But it's clear at level 1, you are just a regular person in combat. And in fact, when you leveled up as a fighter, you pretty much double in your fighting power, which is a big boost. By the way, in case you're wondering, heroes refer to special characters that count as 4 men in the chainmail fighting rules, and the opposite side would need to score 4 hits in order to take down the hero, which many referees probably extrapolated to 2 men and 3 men at 2nd and 3rd level fighter. Okay, number 5. Fall damage was lethal then. Now, original D&D, you died at 0 hit points, unlike modern editions. I'm talking about the scale of damage compared to hit points. It's interesting to me because the formula for calculating fall damage is unchanged from 50 years ago. You take 1d6 damage for every 10 feet you fall. However, in original D&D, and this is extrapolated from a couple of places in the rulebooks, falling 1 inch, they use the scale of a typical wargame to denote 10 feet. Every 1 inch meant you rolled 1 6-sided die for damage. And because the number of hit points you had was determined by rolling a number of dice in accord with what your class advancement chart said, a 4th level fighting man or hero would have 4 dice to determine their, not hit points, but accumulative hits, as it was called then. And so falling 40 feet could be incredibly fatal. Anyway, this is just interesting in retrospect. And to me, and the fact that this formula just hasn't changed for some reason over many years. Okay, number 6, stats were not very important. Your strength, dexterity, intelligence, constitution, charisma, and wisdom did not have much effect in game terms. This is the list of effects given in OD&D. Having a high strength did not make it more likely you would hit your target. It did not mean you would do more damage. Having a high dexterity did not mean you would be harder to hit. The main effect of a high ability score was that it allowed you to accrue experience points more quickly or less quickly. This meant that your character's success depended less on their rolled scores and more on player skill, which calls for a different approach to the game and kind of a different kind of game, period, than what many modern tabletop role-playing games call for and expect. Now, more importance is given to these scores in the first supplement to Dungeons & Dragons called Greyhawk, which is about a year later. But this is the original game. In contrast, your charisma was perhaps your most important ability score. Charisma allowed you to potentially recruit a large number of hirelings to serve and follow your character. And to be clear, we're not talking about hiring mercenaries. Anyone with a low charisma can purchase those. We're talking about having followers who are also fighting men, magic users, and clerics. Given how fast and deadly combat at this time was, using the mass combat system, the number of hits the enemy scored was the number of deaths you had. Given that, having the ability to have followers was very important. And we'll remember the encounter table from earlier, having you encountering possibly hundreds of enemies. As you can see from number 1, this was a war game as well as a dungeon game. And because morale was a thing, your charisma also made it much less likely for them to refuse to follow orders in combat. I hope I made my case that charisma was the most important stat in the original game. Number 8, everyone was a rogue. The rogue class did not exist yet. You only had 3 classes in original D&D derived from these entries from chainmail. You had the heroes, superheroes, and wizards, which later became the fighting men, magic users, and then the addition of cleric. The cleric was some of fighting men and some of magic users. They couldn't even cast spells until 2nd level. They had a different spell list that was more limited than the magic users list, but they had healing spells, so they had a role to fill. Clerics also had the crucial turn undead ability. But non-existent here was what modern players would call a rogue, then called a thief, which came in the first supplement, Greyhawk, 1 year later. The thief class would codify the likelihood you would have of listening to doors, climbing walls, finding traps, disabling traps. But in the original game, these were all things you talked through with your referee, and it didn't matter whether you had the skills or not. Number 9, all classes had the same hit points and did the same damage. The whole variety of dice that D&D players nowadays are used to, of D4 through D20, was not the norm. It did list the different kinds of dice, but you had many more six-sided dice, which was the only type of die you needed in chainmail, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, it's not a surprise that six-sided dice were probably much easier to get in 1974 than these other kinds. But yes, no matter what your class was, you had a number of dice that you rolled, and in the books it did not even specify six-sided dice here because it was just assumed dice by default had 6 sides. But no matter what your class was, you rolled 6-sided dice to determine your hit points. Now, you had a little advantage as a fighting man at level 1, and you advanced more quickly. So my statement's not 100% true, but compared to the modern game, it's a huge shock. Also very interesting, I can see people reading this language at the time as calling for you to re-roll your hit points every time you leveled up. I wonder how many actually did that. That had to be clarified later on. Meanwhile, all weapons did a die of damage. A dagger did just as much damage as a two-handed sword by default. And it was up for the referee to come up with how to adjudicate the advantages of a two-handed sword over other weapons. Now, of course, the book is assuming you have chainmail, and chainmail does have a man-to-man melee table, giving different chances to hit different types of armor. However, this was to determine whether you scored a hit or a kill, not to inflict damage. Conversely, every monster did a die of damage, with some exceptions like the giants being able to score 2 dice of damage, and other very powerful, fantastical creatures. And of course, if you're using the mass combat rules in chainmail, you'll just be chucking a number of d6s, depending on your character's combat power, scoring hits on a 6. With exceptions, as we can see here, when you have 2 different classes of human or humanoid fighting each other. So I found this completely fascinating because it gives context and an explanation for the term hit dice to measure the strength of a creature in later versions of D&D. It was literally the number of dice you rolled to hit enemies and an overall measure of your power and durability. Now, Greyhawk, again, the first supplement a year later, would change these things. One could actually say original D&D was still in development and Greyhawk was the first full iteration of original D&D. There's a good argument for that, but I'm only looking at the original books right now. Okay, number 10. Elves swung both ways. Now, some people may think in original D&D, your race could be your class. You could be the dwarf class. That actually comes later in a different evolutionary branch with basic Dungeons and Dragons. Here, being a dwarf, you had to be a fighting man. Same thing with halflings, which were called hobbits in the original printings before the Tolkien estate told TSR to stop doing that. Elves, meanwhile, could swing both ways. They could be a fighting man or a magic user, but not both at the same time. They got to choose from adventure to adventure. So they'll wake up that morning and say, today I'm going to be a fighting man, or a magic user that day. And while a magic user, they did have the benefit of wearing, well, it says magic armor, but I'm assuming readers then assumed any kind of armor, not just magical armor. This is also the origin of multiclassing, the very first instance. And there are no rules here for splitting your experience points between the 2 classes. It was just another instance of elves being better than everyone else in every way. Number 11. Dungeons discriminated against you in Dungeons and Dragons. There are these weird rules contained in the 3rd book. It says that doors generally cannot be opened easily. You must force them open and score a 1 or a 2 on a 6-sided die in order to do so, and you could have multiple people attempt to do so. Meanwhile, this disallows you from being ready to fight when you reveal what's on the other side. Meanwhile, these doors will automatically close despite the difficulty in opening them. Apparently, they've been weighted to do so in this dungeon. And They will also automatically open for monsters who don't have to go through the same. Physics works differently for monsters, basically. Even if characters want to wedge them open with a spike so that they don't have to open it again, there's a 1/3 chance that that spike will slip and the door will shut. So doors become another enemy you deal with in the dungeon. Similarly, it says that parties must have light sources if they don't have infravision. This, of course, will give you away to monsters. However, monsters, all of them are assumed to have permanent infravision as long as they are not serving some character. So every monster, including those you would not expect to have infravision or dark vision, will get it. And the moment they serve a character, maybe with a charm spell, they stop getting that ability. It's clear that the game is defying symmetry and making the rules of the world change in order to force characters to fumble around in the dark. I can see the design choice, but I thought it was hilarious. Number 12, there was time pressure when exploring a dungeon. This is also on the same lines of creating a certain tension and experience that the designers wanted you to have when delving through the dungeon. There are codified rules for movement. Every 10 minutes, you make 2 moves. For a fully armored character, which has a speed of 60 feet, you travel 120 feet every 10 minutes, which is quite slow. And this is assuming, of course, you are being very careful, searching for traps. And every hour, you must spend 1 turn motionless, resting. And to actually look for secret doors in a wall, every 10-foot section of wall takes a full turn. The spike in the punch is the fact that wandering monsters are rolled every turn. This is more time pressure than we see even in later old school editions that have you roll every half hour or every hour. This is every 10 minutes, and a roll of 6 indicates a wandering monster appears. These rules combine to make delving into the dungeon perilous. Time is against you, and delving deeper into the dungeon also extends the time you'll encounter danger on your way out. A dynamic that I remember from many 1980s computer role-playing games. Kind of cool in my opinion. Okay, number 13, magic users accessed all spells. Many later editions of D&D limit the magic user to what spells they can find and scribe in their spellbook. But there's no language about spellbooks in this game. Here's the language on scrolls. Again, no mention here of copying a scroll to your spellbook. It's merely a consumable item. The writing disappears when you cast it. So a magic user at first level has access to spells like Sleep and Charm Person, which are quite powerful in this game. Now, Gary Gygax would start laying down the law in Greyhawk a year later and limit the number of spells that you can learn per spell level, and also make it quite likely that you will not be able to learn the spell that you want. I'm guessing that there was some early Marshall Caster debates in 1974 and a desire to rein in magic users with Greyhawk and also give some buffs to fighters with the strength table. Anyway, that's my somewhat uninformed opinion. Number 14, languages were weird. There is the common language that we are used to in the original game that most humans, it says, will know. It is assumed that this is spoken throughout the continent. And compared to how languages have developed in real history, this is actually kind of a more liberal way to deal with language. It breaks down language barriers. However, it says by most humans. And so one could read this as that elves, dwarves, and halflings fall in this next sentence. It says all other creatures can speak their own language, although only 20% also know the common one. Now, there is some later language suggesting that humans include elves, dwarves, and gnomes, but many people will miss that. And I'm also going to guess that many referees and tables also just ignore this rule. I mean, that'd be pretty impractical. But this is what's written. But also, you're supposed to overcome these language barriers with alignment languages. Now, that's a thing, which makes the linguist in me shudder. The idea that everyone who is on one side of a metaphysical category somehow are able to communicate with each other. Even neutrality has its own language. If you were neutral aligned, you would be able to speak with orcs, dryads, and giants. It even goes so far as saying that creatures can recognize an opposing language and will attack. Alignment was important in other ways. Intelligent swords had alignments, and artifacts were either lawful or chaotic, no neutral artifacts. And if you were of the opposite alignment, you likely would die just touching it. So as you can see, alignment figured very prominently in the fantasy world that they were creating. And I imagine this is rooted in some of the sword and sorcery fiction that Gary Gygax was steeped in. But to modern players, it's plainly just hard to imagine. For me, the problem is that it's hard to imagine how this actually could function and how a society could work this way. The idea that different creatures of different species would not even consider allying with each other because they're on different parts of this alignment scale, or be perfectly able to understand others and probably get along, even if they were a tribe of murderous orcs. Very peculiar. Okay, number 15, lost class features. Now, D&D was supposed to be run together with Chainmail, which had the actual combat rules. And among those rules is this fantasy reference table that includes a column of special abilities where each letter denotes special abilities of that creature. And here we see that heroes and superheroes, the antecedents to the fighting man, and wizards are included, and they have special abilities. We see that superheroes have the ability to detect hidden, invisible enemies. We get proof of this in Volume 2, where it says that pixies are generally invisible, but certain creatures like dragons and high-level fighters will be aware of their presence. This was the original fighter. They're able to see invisible creatures, they're that good. Also, we see that elves have the ability to be invisible, just like halflings can. Of course, they're not as good as elves. Halflings are limited to brush or woods. Wizards also have the ability to see in the dark and can raise the morale of troops and force morale checks on the enemy, just like heroes and superheroes. I thought this was just fascinating to see some features that made sense in a mass war game fall away, but actually existed and were possibly implemented by some tables because Chainmail was the basis for the rules in Dungeons & Dragons. Next, we cover a few spells that were surprising to me looking back at. I grew up with the basic D&D Red Box and a D&D First Edition, and I was surprised to see how damn powerful Charm Person was. Basically, they come completely under your influence until it's dispelled. It lasts forever. And this is a first level spell. This is akin to the Domination spell, I would argue, that only appears in later books at a much higher level. And Hold Person is not a paralysis spell either. It was similar to Charm Person. It has a limited duration, but it affects 1 to 4 persons. Similarly, the Sleep spell seems to call for a saving throw. It is later known as the I Win spell in later editions. Old school players may be surprised by this, but here's the sleep description. Now, it doesn't say it calls for no saving throw. It says something kind of ambiguous. It says, this spell always affects up to the number of creatures determined by the dice. However, I think one reading this in context and having only the original books, this gets clarified in Greyhawk a year later when Gary Gygax says, no, you can't make a saving throw. But looking only at these original books, every spell allows a saving throw, and this would be quite powerful if it didn't allow one, and one could read the sentence as simply saying it must affect this number of creatures, including possibly members of your party. But yeah, I thought that was interesting to read in its original form. Okay, number 18, Teleport. Teleport presents some obvious challenges for running a campaign. It trivializes long distances, and the Dungeon Master needs to be ready to account for the possibility that the players may teleport somewhere to one or more locations. Well, original D&D had a way to handle that, and that was death. So if you did not have certain knowledge of the destination, there was a 75% chance you would die. Also, it's not clear from this spell that you can affect more than one person beside the caster. But even if you had more familiarity with the location, there was a chance you would teleport low, as in the ground, and probably instantly die, or high. And we know from earlier that fall damage can be fatal. 10 to 100 feet will likely kill a 9th level magic user who had 6+1 hit dice. Even a careful study of the location has a 1% chance of catastrophe. So it was interesting to me to see this old school approach to limiting what players can do with their spells. Okay, number 19, Dead was Dead. Now, this may not be a surprise. Many people know that you died at 0 hit points and you did not have a lot of hit points. It was a very fatal game. My point here is that Raise Dead was a capstone spell for clerics. As you can see, it's a 5th level spell in original D&D, just as it is in current D&D. However, there are only 5 spell levels. It therefore made sense for Raise Dead to be a 5th level spell. One can't imagine a more powerful healing spell than raising someone from the dead, and it was appropriately placed at 5th level. This is before the D20 system and the expectation that top level was level 20. No, the peak of ability you could reach was when you attained 5th level spells, which for clerics, interestingly enough, was attained at 7th level. But yeah, there's no Breath of Life spell. Basically, Dead was dead. By the way, something interesting about the Raise Dead spell, you simply had to point your finger. It was kind of instantaneous back then. However, the low constitution would mean that you might not recover. Here's a constitution part of the table from earlier. If you had an average constitution, there was a 60 to 90% chance you would survive, and it got worse as your constitution was lower. Dead was dead. Number 20, progress was largely via magic items. Now, someone who played at the time, I would love to hear from you, but this is what I'm gathering from what I'm reading. Yes, of course, you could gain much power by leveling up as a fighting man or a magic user or cleric. However, they were going to die, and everyone kind of knew it. And at the same time, your magic items could be passed on to a relative. It said the referee may allow this, but I imagine most tables did this. You would make sure that your magic items would pass on to another character. And some of those items were quite powerful. Wands had 100 charges, and a wand of fireballs could do 66 damage on a fireball with a single charge, greatly increasing the power of whatever magic user would have it. That new character would start at the lowest level of the class they opt for, but if they have a wand of fireballs, they're golden. Now, people who have played role-playing games in the 80s may remember a game called Bard's Tale, where the game came with a very powerful fire horn in your inventory of your default party. This totally reminded me of that. But what struck me about this was that over the course of the campaign and the course of many dead characters, your progress as a player was kind of via your magic items. Now, there's a very popular roguelike game called Darkest Dungeon, where your characters were kind of disposable and you maintained a stable of characters. You decided with each dungeon expedition which characters you could take along. Inevitably, death would meet one of your characters, but you would generally make progress overall because you were always improving the infrastructure of the town that your adventurers are based in. It just struck me that progression in the game in original D&D seemed to be through magic items. Knowing the power of magic items to imbalance a game, they did put a rule in original D&D that many magical items will not survive fire or lightning. When the bearer was killed, they had to make a saving throw to survive. And if they were not on this list of specific items, the item would automatically be destroyed. It was interesting to see this as, I think, a decision to balance the game and not let magic items imbalance the game. And we're going to see in later years Gary Gygax trying to push back against characters getting too powerful. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this tour of history. If you enjoyed the video or have any suggestions of future videos, definitely comment. I wouldn't mind doing more videos of this nature. I'm fascinated by the entire history of D&D and the hobby, not just the original game. And I would love to be able to do some more videos on this, but I don't know if there's interest. One possible topic is looking at how the martial caster balance was handled in older editions of D&D. Another is looking at the transition from wargame to a role-playing game. I'm interested in looking at the evolution from a wargame to something else, both in the details, but also stepping back and looking at the overall scope. So let me know if any of that interests you. And yeah, I have been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. If you haven't yet, join my Discord where we talk, well, mostly Pathfinder 2e. That's been the main focus of my channel so far, but we also talk about other editions and other gaming outside of tabletop role-playing games. And also support my Patreon. I don't earn money as a lawyer. I am able to make these videos because of the support I get through there. You get exclusive access to videos, including me GMing D&D YouTubers through Pathfinder 2e, and also early access to many videos. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time. Begin.